Everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Ryan Kilpatrick. I'm one of the organizers of the Gimme Shelter event, and very thankful and privileged to have John Peterson and Sarah Susanka here with us today. I think a lot of you already know about their work. Just for a quick heads up for me and for John and for Sarah, how many of the folks in this room are students at Kendall right now? Okay, great.
And how many are not?
Great.
It's easier to see.
Perfect. And how many of those who are students of interior design? Excellent. Graphic design? Excellent. Other design students? Great. What are you guys doing? Furniture. Industrial design. Okay, great. So today I think is going to be pretty casual. Sarah and John have sort of offered to share some of their personal and professional experiences with everybody, but I'd really like to open it up to all of you to ask a lot of questions and to sort of figure out what track are you on and how does it relate to what they're doing. I want to give you a really short overview of the other events that are happening today, so that if you have time and you want to stop down to Fountain Street Church later, you're welcome to do that. All of the other events that you'll find in the program are free of charge and open to the public. You don't need to pre-register. So after this, at about 11 o'clock over at Fountain Street Church, there's going to be a session on the Newberry Place co-housing project that's just up the hill in northeast Grand Rapids. And co-housing is a great little way of people to share resources, to design in sort of the not-so-big fashion, I think, and really utilize community space. There's going to be a panel discussion with Mayor George Hartwell, as well as several other community leaders. They're going to talk about what it means, what they feel it means to be sustainable from a lot of different perspectives. So from the perspective of affordable housing, disability advocates, planners, parks and rec, a lot of different fields are going to be involved in that conversation, and I would really welcome some student presence there. Again, that's going to be pretty casual, so we'll definitely make opportunities for you guys to jump in, ask questions, get some feedback. And then the afternoon, there are several sessions as well. There's one on the Congress for New Urbanism. There's one on the Grand Rapids Park Systems. And then this evening, John Peterson will be speaking back at Fountain Street Church at 5, and we'll have a cocktail reception over at the Grand Rapids Art Museum around 6:30. So again, everybody's welcome. That's free to the public. I'd welcome you all to be there. And really what we're trying to do is start a conversation about sustainability, about design, and about creating meaning in public spaces and in personal lives that we can all sort of start to develop a common language about, so that it's not this foreign subject. For those of you who are designers, I think it comes a little more easily. But for those of you who aren't, and for your friends who aren't, I'm hoping that this is an opportunity to sort of start that conversation so that you can begin to have these dialogues with your friends at home or at the bar or wherever else you are, and it can just become commonplace. So from here, I'm going to let Sarah and John introduce themselves, and this can be pretty free flow.
Well, I'm going to stand up so you can see me, because I have a feeling there's a lot of faces back there that can't see. What I want to do, since we've got this time together, is I'm going to talk a little bit about both how I started my business originally and then how I got into writing about what I had learned. And I also want you to feel comfortable to interrupt me and ask questions, because we've got a nice small audience, and so there's a great opportunity for dialogue. I know that all of you right now are sitting in your own individual islands, and you've got lots of questions in your lives. And this talk I'd like to allow to extend beyond just, how do I become a better interior designer or graphic artist, and how do I actually start living what I love to do, which I know in your hearts is where you're really at. How do I make this life that I'm just about to launch into over the next few years into something that's going to fulfill me for the long haul? And so I want to bridge both of those subjects. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about my own story. As some of you know, I started off as an English schoolgirl and moved in 1971 to Los Angeles, which was about as far removed from the place I'd lived before as you can imagine. I grew up in a village of 1,000 people, and I moved to a high school of 4,000. So I didn't even know there were that many adolescents in the world. So it was a little bit of culture shock. But the thing that really struck me when I moved to LA into this huge suburbia that had been built in the 1950s was that it didn't seem like anybody knew each other. You know, we all got around in cars, and my mother was terrified. My father had bought her an Oldsmobile 88, which was a tank of a car, because he was worried about her running into other cars because we were driving on the wrong side of the road. and so she was so scared of this car that she wouldn't drive it. So we ended up walking everywhere. And just put yourself into suburbia, realize that the closest store is about 3 miles away, you know, and you're trying to carry all those bags for 3 miles. It was such a different world than I'd grown up in, where we used to go to the grocery store every day for our groceries for the evening meal. So everything was different, and everything was big. And I started to wonder, why do people live in their houses the way that they do? So at the ripe old age of 14, I was redesigning the American house. I looked at it, I saw all these formal living rooms and dining rooms, and at that time people literally had the plastic covers on the chairs. And I thought, who uses these rooms? Why are they building all these acres of space that they're decorating to the nines? And yet they're all living in their kitchens and their informal living areas, their family rooms. So I started to think about a different way of living. And although in England we had lived much more formally, here in this country I was seeing that people really didn't. And in fact, it became very apparent as I started off in my career into architecture to recognize that what we end up doing is we'll do stuff on automatic just because everybody else does. And so I watched as I was listening to my clients asking for what they wanted in a house, and the first things out of their mouth would be, well, we need a formal living room and a formal dining room and a front foyer, and then they went on with the list of rooms that they wanted. And as I listened, I realized that they were telling me what they were supposed to want, not what they actually wanted. And so I started to learn how to listen with a different kind of ear than what is being told me directly. And so I would ask questions. The greatest tool that you have at your disposal when you're a designer and you're working with clients and customers is to find out how to draw out of them what they really want. And they probably don't have the language to tell you. So you have to learn how to listen in a different way. So the kinds of questions that I found myself asking when I got this list of rooms that people wanted was, well, how often do you use your formal living room? How often do you use your formal dining room? Who comes to the front door? And it's so funny to watch people's faces as there's suddenly this quizzical look, and they go, oh, well, you know, I don't actually use the formal living room. And you just start to realize, oh, well, there's a problem. You know, you're going to spend a good third of your budget on rooms that you're never going to use. How much sense does that make? Another mistake that often gets made when people have those kinds of rooms, let's say they're buying an existing home, is that they fill it with furniture that is not comfortable to sit in. So they're never going to sit there. It's like a stage set for a way of living that we don't live in anymore. And I can't tell you how many people, when I've walked into their house, they're thinking about a remodeling, I'll ask them, you know, when do you use this room? And again, there's that funny look. They're like, well, we don't actually use this room. And why might that be? Well, the furniture is darned uncomfortable. You know, it's just like the connection hasn't occurred. And what architects and designers can do is help people to see where there's a hole in their logic, where they haven't really thought through what they're doing. Another huge issue in a lot of house design is that we used to design houses so that every room was a separate space. And when we lived more formally, say 100 years ago, that was appropriate. Everybody literally withdrew to the drawing room. It was actually originally the withdrawing room, so that you could go away from where the table was and where all the noise of the kitchen close by was, so that you were in a quiet space. And so having it have the possibility of being closed off made all the sense in the world. But now that's not sensible. And so we have this, what in England's called a drawing room, now we here call it the formal living room. Nobody goes into it because you can't see it. And so if you can't see it, you don't use it. So one of the main things we need to do in terms of house design today is simply to open up spaces so that we can see from one space to another. So as I started to listen to my clients as a new architect, I was realizing that we as architects and as designers have a spatial sense. We understand how to move things around to make a place really feel comfortable to live in. But most homeowners, although they want desperately for their house to feel like home, they have no idea how to do it. And in fact, people are usually very timid. They're very frightened that they're going to make some big mistake, especially in the Midwest. Beige is safe, so let's paint it all beige. Let's have beige carpet, beige couches, and beige paintings, and maybe it'll be okay and we won't have made too much of a statement. Well, as all of you in this room know, that is not also going to be a very nice place to live. And so what I was aware of early in my career was that I wanted to put forward some sort of language, some sort of vocabulary so that we could talk with one another and so that we didn't keep misunderstanding what we were looking for. And so how many of you are familiar with a book called A Pattern Language? Ever heard of it? Oh, quite a few of you. A pattern language was written quite a few years ago now in 1975 by an architect who was also a professor at UC Berkeley called Christopher Alexander. And he had a lot of experience in Europe and in England growing up and knew that there were other ways of designing and also knew that human beings have a kind of innate sense of building and of design. But we've been separated from that knowledge. And so we have this, in most of the general public, great fear of making a mistake, and so we do nothing at all. What Alexander tried to do was put together a set of what he calls patterns or concepts that allow people to start talking with one another. And if you've seen the book, A Pattern Language, it's a little bit like a Bible. It's thick. It's got a lot of content. And when I first started my architecture practice, I used to lend my copy of A Pattern Language to my clients, and then I wouldn't see them for a year while they read the book. Because it really is all-consuming. It's wonderful. It's life-changing in many ways because it does give people the possibility of being able to talk with each other, with their builder, with their architect, with their interior designer, their real estate agent, about what it is that they want. But they don't have, suddenly time goes out the window, and if you're trying to make a living from the clients that walk through your door, that is not always the best business move. And so what I started to do was to put those same ideas into language and pictures that were more familiar to homeowners. And so those of you that are familiar with my books, Home by Design, I actually dedicate to Christopher Alexander. And it's a visual lexicon of the types of things that architects and designers think about all the time and design into those buildings and homes that we're working on, but that most homeowners do not understand. And so by naming something, you can start to ask for it. It's not new to architects, it's not new to designers, but it is new in that we can start to talk with one another. And so a lot of what I've really done with my career is become a translator so that we can start to talk together. It's incredibly important. In fact, I thought I understood how important it was when I first wrote The Not So Big House, because I knew that I had all these blank faces looking at me across the desk as I was trying to find out what somebody wanted in their home, and could tell that they were really very intimidated by the idea of working with an architect to start with. I wanted to really level the playing field so that we could all be talking about their dreams. This is your dream house, it's not my dream house. And so as I started to put this language together, I could see how people began to open up. They got excited, they got engaged in the process, and they found a way to be able to talk with me as opposed to, fearfully speak, well, I might want such and such. So your job as designers is going to be very much in that same vein. No matter where your career takes you, communication is one of the key issues, and you want to make sure that who you're speaking to, that they understand how to talk to you so that you can hear them and they can hear you. when the Not So Big House came out and I started to talk to audiences of the general public that had never been to an architect, I found that even more than people who had actually hired an architect, these folks had no idea even what an architect was or what an architect does. And the same holds true for design. Most people have no clue what's possible. And what I've found is that about 5 minutes after an architect starts talking to their client, they're lost. The client is sitting there going, and they have no clue. I don't know how many of you have worked in architecture or design offices, but you may have had this experience. You've put your drawings up on the wall, and you're walking your client through what you've designed, and then one of the couple will come up and say, well, with this master bedroom, and they're pointing at the staircase. And you're thinking, okay, we have a problem here. We are not communicating. And I can't tell you how many people are really very, very at sea when it comes to a drawing. In fact, one of the things I've learned, I got married first to a man in 2000 who has a wonderful spatial sense but has no ability to read drawings, which for an architect is terrifying. We were designing things and I was saying, well, let me just draw it for you. And every time I said that, I lost him. He could not understand what I was drawing. And so we had to learn how to communicate about space in an entirely different way. And that's the challenge. You've got to meet your client, or in this case, my husband, in the place that they are able to understand. And that's the most important job you have. Because if you're not communicating, no matter how beautiful the design you've come up with, they can't see it and they will miss the boat. And it's very frustrating when you have not communicated. You'll find that during construction, a homeowner will start changing things and you think, why are they changing this? This is the most important part of the design. But they don't know that. They haven't got it. So you have to find the tools to be able to understand what it is that I'm looking at as a homeowner. I'll give you a few of the stories from the trenches of massive frustration. I had one client who couldn't even read a model. So I saw how difficult it was for her to perceive space. And so we designed what I thought was a really beautiful room, and we built a model of that room so that you could just hold it up to your eye and you could look inside the model. And so she was given this model, and I made the mistake of not saying first off, hold it to your eye. So she's looking at the outside of the model, which is nothing. It's just, all the cardboard. The inside is the point. She couldn't get over the fact that the outside of the model didn't tell her anything. I said, just hold it up to your eye. This is just how I made the inner space. She would not do it. It was unbelievably frustrating. And you will meet people who will tax every ounce of patience you have in your system. It happens. We are there to help, but there are places where that person is not going to be helpable. And you just have to kind of let go at that point and just say, well, I'll do what I can, but you can't go beyond a certain point. And you have to realize that that person is dealing with their own inner demons and that you've got to just sort of let them make their way through it. So there's a point where you can try to help, and then there's a point where you just have to let go and realize that whatever's going to happen is going to happen. There have been a few clients where they've been really determined to do something that I know is going to be detrimental to the house, to their lives within it, and to their neighbors' lives. And I have backed out of a couple of projects where I've said, you can do that, you can find somebody to design that for you, but I'm not going to be the person to do it. So what you're doing there is you are literally saying, yes, it's possible, but I don't want my name on it. And if I don't want my name on it, I would like you to think about seriously if you want to have that. And then they can make that decision. You're not saying it in a rude way. You're just saying this is your decision, but if you go that direction, you need to find a different person. And I don't recommend doing that very often. Usually there are ways of coaxing people into a direction that you know is going to be good for them. But it's a very fine line. This is their house. They get to do what they want. But you also are the arbiter of the integrity of your own designs. And when you feel like you're being asked to do something that's really outside of that integrity, you can say so. So it's a very interesting world you step into with design, because on the one hand, it is certainly subjective, and everything that you do is you're going to be seen through that lens. People are going to say, oh, Linda designed this, or Susan designed this, or so people will look at that and they know you and your designs through what you've done before. So you need to be comfortable with what you're doing. And so that edge is a very interesting and tricky line. The vast majority of people you'll work for are terrific people, and they come to you because they love what you do. And what you put out there, you will attract the same kind of energy back. So if you put your heart and soul into something and you make something that you really are pleased with, you're going to find others who find that same thing really beautiful and really interesting to be in. There's some tools about how to let the world know what you've done, which I find that most architects and designers are unaware of. And that has to do with how you tell the story of the project that you've just worked on. Most of us who are attracted to the world of design and architecture tend to have a very high standard for ourselves. And if one or two things in a project are not perfectly executed, we feel like we can't show that to anybody. The fact is that 90% of that project is wonderful. And if you will tell the story to the press and to the media, let them know there's an interesting story. For example, today, anything about green design or sustainable architecture is going to be of interest to the press. Anything, I've got the right brand right now, and not so big. People are interested. And so you can start to tell those stories, but you don't have to focus on the corner of the kitchen that didn't get executed properly. You can steer the cameras towards the things that you really are proud of and really pleased with. And also recognize that even if they do accidentally cover that corner that you hate, nobody but you is actually going to notice. So our high standards end up causing us to really both belittle and minimize the ability for us to tell our stories. You have to get your stories out there. That's how people find you. One of the challenges of residential design and residential architecture is that the homeowner knows about the project, and their friends know about the project, but nobody else knows. And so you can ask your client, may I see if I can find some media that would be interested in covering this story? Some will say yes, some will say no. I always encourage you to ask the media to respect the individual's privacy, to not give the exact location of where the project is, and not to use their last name. That's sometimes an uphill battle, but it really helps the homeowner to not feel like they're suddenly living in a glass fishbowl because everybody knows. But it's something that will help you and it will help them long term. So your own work is your best sales tool. And as you recognize that that's true, you're going to be able to really make more of what you love to do just by telling the stories. Don't be shy, because the media needs stories, and Lord knows they need better stories than we usually have out there. So we can tell some amazingly positive stories, and I think people are hungry for that right now. Even if you're just starting out. When the very first edition that I did was for a friend, and it was right after I had finished my master's degree, and I didn't even think of myself really as an architect yet. I had just barely gotten my license, and I was actually laid off, and so I had done this in my free time. And serendipity has a way of stepping in when you most need help if you pay attention. What happened was that my friend who I designed the addition for wanted to have a party to celebrate the end of the project. And she told me, well, why don't you invite anybody that you want to come to the party? And I invited my boss from my old firm, where I had been working for a couple of years. Well, it turned out he couldn't come, but his wife came. And I didn't know his wife, but his wife worked for the local paper. She happened to be on assignment that evening. She had a camera with her, and she walked through and goes, oh, this would be a great story. And so the next day, she came with a crew and a reporter. They interviewed the homeowner, they interviewed me, they took photographs. It was a front page story. Now, you can't orchestrate that kind of thing. This is, when you think that you're responsible for trying to make this stuff happen, recognize you can't be. If I had tried to make that happen, I would absolutely have jinxed it. And there was no way I could have even conceived of it. But that launched my firm in 1983. That's what got us rolling. Suddenly, I had 10 or 12 homeowners around Minneapolis and St. Paul wanting to hire my firm. My firm was me. I didn't even have one yet. And I was just finishing up my master's degree, as I mentioned, and so I asked my thesis advisor, would you be interested in starting a business with me? Because, you know, I've got all this work. And so Dale Malfinger and I ended up starting a firm, and he brought the desks and I brought the typewriter, and we rented this tiny little space for, I think it was $300 a month in a building very close to the University of Minnesota campus. And within about 3 months, we realized we needed to hire somebody, and the only place we could have hired somebody was by hanging them from the ceiling. So we decided we might need just a little more space. And gradually, over the course of the next few years, we expanded and leased more of the space in that building. And we grew very incrementally. We never actually borrowed any money to create that office. We did a lot of speaking around town at continuing education through the University of Minnesota, at the local science museum. Here's another serendipitous thing. We decided we wanted to do a day-long workshop just helping homeowners understand what goes into a house. How do you design a great house? And what are the constituent parts of a house that you need to know about? And we talked about energy efficiency and so forth. And we invited some of our local friends who were professionals, who could speak to these issues. We ended up getting an ad put in the paper. We didn't orchestrate this. The local paper found out about the Science Museum talk. 350 people came. And suddenly we had basically what looked like a lifetime of clients. We didn't hard sell to them. We didn't say, we can do this for you, you should come and work with us. We said, this is what architects do. This is what interior designers do. This is what energy efficiency experts do. And we helped people to learn how to make their house better. What happens then is when they're thinking about hiring somebody, they think about you as the expert, and they will come to you. Hard selling is not required. Helping people to understand how to make their house better is the real core. And I'm talking about this related to residential architecture because that's what I've done, but it's true of any different field. You start to speak about what it is that you love, and people will come and find you. How many of you were at the talk that I gave last night? Any of you? A few of you. One of the things that I talked about last night was how important it is to pay attention to what your heart longs to do. And this really will draw you into the long-term view for your career. When you pay attention to what your heart's longing to do, what happens is that you are 100% engaged in that pursuit. Because you love it, you are completely present in what you're doing. And in fact, it's not the what you're doing that matters, it's that presence. When you're engaged in something and you're completely in the moment, it has a kind of magnetic quality. And other people will want to come and find you because you're doing that. And that's exactly what happens. When you follow that interior compass that says, okay, that's what I love, you'll find that people will find you because of that passion that you're pouring into it. And when you talk to the local paper, or you talk to the local media, or you write a blog post about it, when you've got that passion, it attracts people in a way that you couldn't imagine. And that's honestly the best kind of promotion that you can give yourself. And it's got nothing to do with hard selling. So in many ways, it's a huge relief. It makes things so much simpler. All I have to do is do what I love. I mean, that's amazing. And it's really true. Now, I have to add a proviso to that, and that is that when you first start out in a career, you want to follow your heart, but there are a huge number of things that you do not know yet. Once you get out of school, although you may be an A student in school, you'll discover that as the lowly person on the totem pole, you're doing things that you really don't enjoy doing. In architecture, the joke is that you're drawing bathroom details for the first 3 years of your career. You know, it's like, oh God, another bathroom detail, please. But the fact is you are actually learning other things than how to draw bathroom details. By just being in the milieu of an office, you're absorbing so much about how buildings go together, how design happens. And there is a process of immersion in the environment in which design happens, where you're learning stuff that you couldn't name at that particular moment, but that in the long haul will stand you in good stead. There are certainly times when it's time to move on, or where you feel like your talents are not being observed. But what I would encourage you to do first is to talk to your boss or talk to one of the principals of the company. Tell them what your aspirations are. Because when you focus on the things that you really want to do, and you tell people about those things, they are much more likely to try to help you to find a place to start living those desires. If you tell them the things you don't want to do, you're going to get the exact opposite. So what I talked about last night is state your intentions and then let go, but focus on what you do want, not what you don't want. One of the strange aspects of consciousness that we don't really realize is that when we say, I absolutely don't want this, the absolutely don't want part gets not heard, and the want that is what you hear. So you may notice if you have thoughts of what you don't want all the time and you keep attracting to you those things that you don't want, just rephrase the what I want. Put it into the affirmative rather than the negative. And you'll find a very, very different life experience comes your way. So it's being receptive and open as opposed to closed and saying it's got to look like this or I'm not interested. And it's a very, very powerful piece of knowledge that will allow you a great deal more flexibility. So in those first years of your career, you're almost certainly not going to have the perfect long-term job. Living your dreams, you're going to think about what I'm saying today and you're going to go, but this doesn't feel like what I always longed to do. But recognize that you are being prepared in a way that you can't currently know for what comes next. And so putting in that time and learning and just being open and being like a sponge from all the professionals that are around you, even if you're not working with them directly, you can be looking at how somebody that you admire does something. You can ask them about it. You can ask them, can I learn from you? You know, it doesn't have to be during the workday, but can you just tell me how you do what you do? All those things about the inquisitiveness, the curiosity of how do I learn how to do something that's going to, in the long term, make me a better professional is going to stand you in terrific stead. And most likely that person that you've asked if you can apprentice with in some way will find a way to bring you into their project. So all these things are very simple sort of rules of thumb for how to engage, but they're incredibly important. And then what you'll find after a few years is that you have developed enough of your own knowledge base that you can start to practice on your own or work within a firm and start getting more and more responsibility. Don't be afraid of what you don't know. It's the learning and learning like a sponge that will stand you in the best stead. And it's amazing what happens. There's always those first few years where it's frustrating and it's a little bit hard, but it's you're building the launch pad for the rest of your career. And that launch pad can be something that will give you decades of really wonderful work from there on. So I think that's a good beginning to sort of set the stage for what I suspect some of you at least are thinking about. I want to do one other thing before I close my remarks. Most of you got one of these cards. How many people did not? Oh, good. One back there. You'll have to imagine. Okay. This is something that if I'd had enough cards, I would have done last night. But this is obviously a two-dimensional card. How many of you have ever heard of Magic Eye? Oh, really? Quite a few of you. Okay, fantastic. Well, Magic Eye was developed by two mathematicians, I think in the 80s. And they discovered a way that within a two-dimensional image, they could bury a three-dimensional form. And some of you who've seen Magic Eye images before know that some of them, when you look at it, you actually see a completely different form within the picture. This one is not that. This one allows you to see this same image, but it will pop into 3 dimensions. And so if you look, first of all, just look at the card without trying to do anything with it, you'll see that there are 7 8-balls in that 1/3 of the way down the picture. What you have to do to see this is it's the opposite of what you think. You start with it right close to your face, and then you gradually move it away, and you're just letting your eyes be soft focused. You're not trying to focus on something. And almost like you're looking through the page. And then for me, right about here, it pops into 3 dimensions. And when it does, there's no question. But in case you're wondering, there are then 8 8-balls instead of 7. This is a pretty good room to do it because it's bright. If you're in a dark room, it doesn't work. And if you've only got one eye that works, it doesn't work. Here we go. Now, why am I showing you this? It's because in our lives, there is a level of experiencing that most of us are completely unaware of. In this 2-dimensional card, how can there possibly be a 3-dimensional experience? It doesn't make sense to us. In the same way, in our everyday lives, there's a quality of experiencing that is so much more meaningful than anything that we normally experience. And it results from being involved completely engaged in what we're doing, completely present in what we're doing. And when you are living from that place, it's automatically meaningful. Most of us are looking for our meaning and purpose outside ourselves, and we're constantly trying to find that in what we're doing, or getting a better job, or a better this, a better that. The real meaningfulness comes from being passionately engaged in what you're doing in the moment. And that's the only place that real meaning resides. And it's right here, and it's always right here. So no matter what you're doing, if you are completely engaged in it, it's going to have that meaningfulness. And that's everything to do with who you are on the inside. And this is a lot what I was talking about last night, and what the Not So Big Life is really oriented to. It's about how we redesign our lives, how we rethink how we engage what we engage, so that we can start to really live a much fuller life no matter what we're doing. And so as you go about your new careers, pay attention to how you are centered within yourself and how you're engaging whatever it is that you're doing. So when you're engaging it in the moment, and when you're really just focused on what you're doing as you're doing it, rather than texting and emailing and thinking about all the other things you've got to do next, or the mistake you made about 10 minutes ago, just be right here. It's an entirely different experience, and it's just as powerful, if not much more so, than seeing the 3D vision of this card. I actually found out that part of what's so addictive about magic eye images is actually releases serotonin into your brain. So once you start getting these, it's like you want to see more. So just keep that in mind. If you want to be reminded, stick this up on a bulletin board somewhere so you can remember there's more here than meets the eye, but I have to show up in the moment completely in order to experience it. You'll all go through those moments where you are frustrated or fearful that you've picked the wrong career, or, we all do it. But just stay the course, recognize that this too shall pass, and that if you can just calm your mind and just engage what's happening without all the thoughts that are driving you crazy, just sort of drop them and say, okay, this too shall pass, and watch what happens. You'll be supported in ways you can't possibly imagine. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say, I've been thinking this whole time, listening to you talk, and I saw you last night. What in the world, what in the world can I talk about? I guess I want to...
Let me give you this, because I have a feeling you're going to need it.
Can you guys hear me? I'm not sure that I do. Can you guys hear me?
We've got the TV.
Oh, I see. But I've got the handheld. You're going to need this because you're going to need to talk.
All right.
If you don't mind... Is this working? Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to put some parameters around what I think you're saying, and maybe this is obvious to you guys, but Sarah's viewpoint has an awful lot to do with her spiritual interests. And I think what's unusual, particularly within the design world, is Sarah is someone who's talking about space making, how we live, how we work, through her spiritual lens. And so it's just not a conversation we get to have very often. And I think it's a very interesting one. And it comes from, you know, your own specific path, what you value. And it's one of the things that strikes me is there's actually an awful lot of overlap between our careers, though quite different in many ways. But how I am not presenting this through my spiritual lens, but in a sense maybe that's not possible. But you know, so much of the way I think about the challenges that I face in what I'm doing, and I'm going to talk a little about that. That the sort of spiritual life and that seems so separate in many ways. Of course, they're connected. It cannot be. Anyway, forgive me for that thing. But I was just struck by that's just not a conversation we get to have very often. And it's unfortunate that we don't have a conversation. And I think it's a real value to have you talking about looking at practice or at your career from outside of the nuts and bolts of what we normally discuss, which is, you know, what skill set you need, what sort of the techniques by which you manage your clients, the managing of expectations. Those are the kinds of things we talk about a lot. Anyway, I'm going to talk just a little bit how we overlap. Again, I'm thinking about how do I enter this conversation. But so I'm going to talk about how we overlap and how there's some real differences. So I actually started my practice right out of school, as you did. But I didn't start my practice because of an opportunity that was an opportunity that we'd all want. In a sense, I started my practice from an opportunity that would be an opportunity that most of us wouldn't. And that's probably fairly indicative of my life. And I came into practice, or I came into, you know, or out of school in 1990, which was the last recession, if you don't think of the dot-com bust. And I was not very skilled at how to insert myself into the world of the job market. I did run across a deck of cards that I had filled out dutifully with the name of the firm, when I mailed the resume, the phone call that I'd made, who I had talked to, the follow-up phone call, the whole thing. I had learned somewhere along the line to do that. But I didn't understand how one connects their relationships together to capture a job. Those weren't sort of skills that I didn't learn those sort of skills until I got older, and actually I'm still struggling with them now. But I had an opportunity to help somebody get a permit, just a building permit, and only a building permit. And that led to a gentleman who that's what he did for a living, and ended up hiring me just to draft up. This was the sort of the lowest rung on the architectural ladder, you know, devoid of design, devoid of much strategic thinking, except for how do you manage the permit process. But I needed to pay rent, and I was building up a credit card bill, and there was something to learn, because I didn't, you know, I was absolutely green, and so I ended up helping this gentleman do this. But one of the advantages to that, and I rarely ever talk about this, but one of the advantages to that is that these projects were enormously short. I was generally working with people who at least felt they couldn't afford full services of a design professional, but they just needed to get over this hurdle of entitlement, which, and this is in the city of San Francisco. I'd moved to San Francisco. I had gone to school at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is not so different from this place, I would believe. And I'd moved to San Francisco. I was in a new place, and where entitlement is a big deal. I spent some time at the Rural Studio just last week. I don't know. Are you guys familiar with the Rural Studio? It's out of Auburn University, and there are no permits in where they are. I mean, there should be a permit process, and obviously there's code requirements, but in fact, they never get permits for the work that they do. So anyway, it's a strange bookended condition. But I ended up working with people who didn't have a lot of resources, although they were living in San Francisco. They owned property, and those are not insignificant resources. But I got an opportunity to work on a lot of projects very, very quickly, and actually help people change their lives in ways that I wouldn't otherwise have had an opportunity to do. So let's tear down that wall. Let's not leave that wall up. Let's rotate the kitchen. Again, I'm doing permits, so I'm really looking at just the most fundamental things, not looking at details. But what if we rotate that kitchen and you're facing this direction rather than that direction? And what if you'll interact with your family better? And where are your kids going to sit? And those really basic questions, very fast. And that actually, I met a bunch of contractors and real estate agents, and they're always looking for it. By the way, if you want to start a practice,
Yes.
The real estate community and the general contracting community are always looking for a designer who will work for cheap and will work for fast. And mostly, you want to run from that like crazy. But there is a way to build a practice
It's true.
through this. There is work out there for this. And if you can stomach it, and if you can see an opportunity in it, and I look back now and I can see there was an opportunity, there's actually a practice to be made. It comes with some real serious baggage, which you want to take, you want to look at hard. And I struggled with that baggage for years because I believe this fits in with Sarah's way of looking at the world. What you do is what is likely that you will continue to do. So if you do permits come to you. So, and after I had a practice of 10 people and we're doing, some really nice work, I would routinely get a phone call from somebody who would say, I need to renovate my bathroom. Can you give me a permit for it? Anyway, so I got an opportunity to think about helping people. And if I look back over my career, interestingly, I've had this conversation with a friend of mine who has, is later on in his career as a designer, and his frustration that none of what he had done he was terribly proud of. Back to your point about, it's a couple of things that went wrong. I put it in the drawer and put it away. I'm terribly guilty of this. And one of the things that if I look back over in that conversation, I was looking back over my career, and I realized that some of the things that I felt most cleanly proud of, so to speak, were those opportunities to help people rethink the way their house was laid out that I know affected the quality of the engagement they had with their family and friends. And that was, that's very, very important stuff. Maybe far more important than the really refined details as my practice grew that I had an opportunity to do. Really think about we got to the point where we were going to the mill, choosing the log, or what's often referred to as the flitch, choosing the log that we wanted the wood to come from, and then instructing exactly where we would cut within that flitch and exactly how that would be laid up in the panels that we wanted to go into the projects that we were doing. And then talk very carefully about how that would be finished, how much fill would be used in the finish, in the finish. That, of course, was some of the most interesting work and most satisfying work. But if you balance it against how we were affecting people's lives, how we were changing people's lives, it starts to diminish fairly quickly. It's pretty interesting. Now you're talking about a refinement of craft that only a tiny few of your clients will appreciate and will actually ask you to do. Much of that work is done not quite in spite of your client's interests, but as a kind of bonus that they haven't asked for,
Right.
if you know what I mean. So anyway, so I built a practice up, and then, and mostly residential, although we were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And if you start doing permits like that, I worked on a peanut factory at one point, and you end up doing all kinds of stuff. You end up in these really unusual environments. But at some point in my practice, about 10 years into my practice, there was a shift that happened. And when did you write the first book? How
1998,
and how long had you been in practice?
15 years.
Yeah, so it's not so different, right? And you may have had a similar feeling. Like, so in the beginning, it's like you don't even know that you can make this work. And
Right.
you're just thrilled that it actually happens, and you can send out an invoice, and it gets paid, and you can get a
It's a
client,
miracle.
and it's a miracle. Yeah, it's actually a problem for our profession is that we are so surprised that we get paid, or so slightly uncomfortable about asking to get paid. We often don't ask to be paid, and there's tens of thousands of dollars, and I'm actually reducing that number for you. But there's a tremendous amount of money that, in fact, was owed me that, for one reason or another, I never. You'll see. This does actually happen. It sounds crazy, but it does happen. But somewhere about 10 years into my practice, I was again primarily doing residential work, working very closely with individuals, with families, very small groups. I knew their lives I knew an awful lot about their lives and an awful lot about their habits. In some cases, maybe more than I really wanted to know. And that was very satisfying. And I was bringing that knowledge, the knowledge of their childhood and what was meaningful to them, and the kind of way they entertained, and all these kinds of things. And I was bringing that all the way down to the selection of the grain of the wood and that sort of stuff. And around that time, our practice started to grow a little bit, and we started getting some larger projects, and I started doing some mixed-use development. And it started to those decisions were starting to impact neighborhoods and communities, and they were starting to impact people I didn't know, I would never meet, and that was a tremendously delightful thought, and it captured my imagination. The idea of designing for this much more complex organism of a neighborhood or a community, and as a way of accelerating that desire, or the opportunity to pursue that desire. Practices move relatively slowly in many ways, particularly into new markets. But as a way of accelerating that, I essentially invented a competition for the office. I actually looked out in the world and said, oh, what competitions are out there? Because that's what architects do, or designers do. They go and do competitions. I have a very low satisfaction with competitions and the structure of competitions. But realized that the sort of return on one's investment in these competitions were terribly low. And what a smarter strategy might be, at least in my mind at that time, is why don't we develop our own program, put it in our own neighborhood, have a single problem, we'll develop the problem, and then we'll solve that problem. And just very quickly, that led to something in our own neighborhood in San Francisco. We addressed something that was a neighborhood issue without really a goal in mind other than to exercise our minds and our muscles. We got a fair amount of attention to that project, and several city agencies were very enthusiastic about it and encouraged us to pursue it. And it struck me that there would be an opportunity as a designer to simply choose their own work. And to put a finer point on it, as designers, the vast majority of us, almost without exception, wait for the phone to ring or to be approached with somebody with a problem. We do not identify the problem. Somebody else identifies the problem. Maybe we help people frame the problem. Maybe we help people rethink the problem. The problem isn't that we don't have formal living room.
Right.
The problem is that we want to live better, and we don't know how to do that. And so maybe you're reframing that problem, but somebody's bringing you that problem. And so if you imagine out in the world who are the decision makers about what the problems are in the built environment, architects are not present for the most part. And we had turned that a bit. We had said, well, what is the problem and what is the solution? And I started becoming interested in, well, who's doing this kind of work? And at the time, I just stated to you that no one's doing this for the most part, but at the time I didn't know that. We were asking around, who's doing this kind of work? Who's out in the world identifying those problems as a designer? And realized that, not completely, but nearly effectively, no one's out there doing that. And I had this image in the middle of the night of a firm or an organization that would take that on as an opportunity that would both solve the problem but also would identify the problem. And in a moment of great naivete, I decided that we would start that organization or that practice. And it's called Public Architecture. It's a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, but it's nationwide. Again, starting with that idea of putting oneself as problem identifier and problem solver. Quickly, we realized the vehicle to enter this was effectively our own pro bono work. We would start this, as we had in this project, for free, and then we would develop a client base from that. That led us to thinking about pro bono practice in our practice. We were looking around, trying to understand who's doing pro bono work. And this is the kind of thing that you probably know the legal profession does quite routinely. Lawyers are often providing pro bono services to those that can't afford legal services. And so we looked out in the world, and so what's the design community doing with pro bono practice? And
I have to interrupt for 1 second.
Yeah, please.
Does everybody know what pro bono means?
Yeah, sorry.
It means we do it for free.
Right.
Just in case.
It's based in the Latin. It means for the public good, actually. The true base meaning is for the public good. We now accept it as for free.
Right. Good point.
But
yeah.
it's a very interesting. It's a very interesting sort of dichotomy. And so we looked out into our world and realized that very little was going on to support this. And so in another moment of great naive thirst, we decided that we would help institutionalize pro bono service within the practice. And we started a program called the 1%, where we ask every design professional in the country to give 1% of their time to pro bono service. And at this point, we have 900 plus firms across the country, from single person offices to literally the largest firms in our country, who have signed up to do this. And at the moment, and it's still very much in the early stage at the moment, it's just about $30 million of service that's going to primarily nonprofit organizations across the country. And we also match firms with nonprofits. So we have an online dating service for professionals. So firms who want to be matched with a nonprofit organization or a nonprofit that needs design services can go online and do this online dating. And I know David is a 1% member and had mentioned that. Have you actually done the active choosing of being in the matching component yet?
I don't know. It was a couple of years ago that I signed up.
Yeah, maybe you didn't do that. I think you told me you haven't been stalked yet. So, so I actually ran those two. Well, in a sense, my first act when I made this decision was to hire a full-time executive director, because I knew that if I did try to do it in my part-time, it would just never happen. But I was enormously active. It was incubated in my office space, and so I gave it desk space and gave it part of my staff's time, and we built that organization up. And over a 6-year period, I tried to balance the two of those things, which I didn't do a terribly good job of. And about 2 years ago, decided that I needed to make a choice, and I conveniently, right before the turn in the economy, I shrank my private practice, and now actually have that private practice still exists, but I have a single job, which is managed through the staff of another firm. So my 100% of my energy, barring a couple of hours a week, is spent on building an organization. And so now my energy is spent thinking about long-term organizational strategy, the sort of ecosystem of how to build something that will last for decades, and the challenges of raising money and thinking about people's behavior and where is practice going, and engaging the not-for-profit world in helping them understand how to exploit design as a tool to further their mission. These kinds of enormously difficult, long-term, exhausting, but gets one up. The pleasant way to finish that sentence, gets one up in the morning. The not so pleasant is gets one up in the middle of the night thinking about how to do that, which I get to do quite often. So I have a lot of thoughts about where people can go as a student coming out of school, because of my own background in starting a practice, in doing a little bit of work. I only worked in firms for just a bit, but also alternative ways to think about what careers design training provides you. And I believe this is important. And I don't know the sort of culture of this school, but the culture of school that I went to, if you did not come out and be a narrowly defined designer, you had failed in some way. If you came out and took another kind of job that didn't mean the discipline of thinking through the careful detailing of the built environment, you had failed in some way. And that was absolutely ingrained and embedded in me. And it actually was a very difficult thing for me to allow myself to shift out of that. Now, I don't know if that's, again, the culture here, but I encourage you to think about the skill sets you're learning, which are good as a design, being educated as a designer, and that those skill sets are valuable outside of what we normally think about as design as a design practice. I think I'm going to stop with that.
Can I add one observation about what you've said and what I was talking about? You made a comment that just sort of accidentally in the middle of the night one night you had this outrageous vision, and you talked about it as a certain naivete. But all of us have this moment in our lives at some point where you're being given an incredible opportunity, and it comes to you unbidden. I mean, that's how I started writing, was that you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I could do this. It will turn your career around in ways that you can't imagine if you step through that door. And although we can call it naivete, what really is happening is somebody's saying, wake up, this is your opportunity, this is your moment. And to actually do it, as you've obviously done, I mean, look at what has happened as a result of that act. People around the country are changing the worlds they live in because of that thought. And the fact is, we don't think it. It gets thought through us. And when you pay attention, amazing things happen. So
I'll point out that Sarah, I'm the Eeyore character in this piece. So Sarah said she realized I can do that. The could part was the thing that was missing when I made that decision. I just said, I'm gonna do this. God only knows if I can, but I'm gonna do it.
That's great.
So here's an interesting thing. I mean, you pointed out the value of being present,
right,
and removing those extraneous, bits and pieces that are flying in and out. How does one identify what's a distraction,
right,
and what is an opportunity? What's true, or I think fundamentally this is a challenging thing. Like, how do I have a very active mind,
right,
which is a constant companion for me, for good and for worse. And how do I understand, well, what's part of, what's a cerebral thought,
right,
and what is valuable to pay attention to, and what's valuable not to pay attention to?
The answer to that I have is what makes you resonate, what makes you feel like, oh, that I feel like I'm a tuning fork all of a sudden, that there's something that's vibrantly alive in it. But essentially, all those thoughts going through our heads, we're just tuning into a radio station. It's not our particular thought. If I could just tune into all of the thoughts in all of these heads, there are probably you know, 20% that are thinking this kind of thought and 20% thinking that kind of thought. You know, it's like we're literally, these devices are like radios, and we're tuning into various thought forms. So the day that you had that thought about starting the 1% project, there were probably lots of other people that were having that same thought. You acted on it, you know. So we get moved by various things, but the thought forms, there are some that are very debilitating, that stop us from doing thing after thing after thing, and there are those that allow us to rise up to something much more. And that was one of those. And just pay attention to the ones that make you feel like, that feels like it. You know, what is it? But there is no right answer. So it's not like you have to figure it out. Just move with what's really pulling you the hardest.
So do we dare see if anybody have any questions about this stuff?
Let's dare.
All right.
Because we're all present.
Yes, right.
And I have but one request. Please speak into the microphone with your question and stand so that we can all hear. Anybody?
There's one. A brave soul.
Put that down the ground.
Does it work?
No.
Does it work?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, first I wanted to thank you both for joining us today. As students, we've come to read your books, and they're inspiring, and they help us grow as a designer. So it's really, really great to have you. I guess what I'd like to ask both of you as designers, it's maybe an obscure question, but what inspires you? What inspires you to create the things that you create?
Well, I'll start and say that the thing that inspires me the most is making environments that are better for the people that are living there. And so I actually started early in my career teaching both at the University of Minnesota and at Iowa State. And I started to notice as I was working with students that the places that they liked to hang out were a really good tuning into what makes people feel alive. And it isn't always about what we think of as great architecture, as great design. So I just asked people to pay attention to the places that inspired them. And you're asking me the same question. I have paid a lot of attention to what environments, both internal and outside and in nature, that make me feel most alive. And that's the best tool that you have in your toolbox to help you to design places for people that will make them feel alive. You have to use your own senses to teach you about the environment before you can help anybody else to make that environment wonderful for them. They may not have the same inclinations as you, but as you start to pay attention to what makes you feel like, wow, this is a great spot, you can then learn how to ask the right questions to find out what's true for that client or that customer. So the places that have inspired me have been very varied. I spent some time as a student in Barcelona and studied the work of Antonio Gaudí. And there's something absolutely magic about his work that just riveted me. I've learned a lot from Frank Lloyd Wright, but the story that doesn't often get told is that to start with, I was assiduously avoiding studying Wright because everybody studied Wright. And I studied Japanese architecture, and one of the first professors that was looking at my work after I'd finished a built project said, "Oh, when did you start studying Wright?" I said, "I haven't." But we have the same roots in Japanese architecture. And then I did start to study what Mr. Wright had been doing and realized that he had so many lessons to teach people that weren't articulated. So many people think of Wright's work as a style. And what he was really doing was designing in all three dimensions much more adeptly than a lot of the architects who we revere and emulate. So I started to look more at that and really try to help a larger portion of the public understand that the third dimension, the heights of everything, really affect our experience. And as we can understand more of that, we can design much more interesting spaces that have more modulation without them having to be huge. So we've tried to get interest with bigness, where I think that when you can tailor space, so in all three dimensions, it really shifts your experience. But I've had, many architects have inspired me. Louis Kahn is another one whose work I really love. So they're very varied, very, very varied styles. But all of them have this spiritual component. They understand that there's something more that architecture and good design brings to the fore that we can't name exactly, but we can certainly feel it.
There are two ways I can think about answering that question. One, what inspires me in the sense that what do I find sort of quickens my pulse or my heart rate, and it changes. I'm sure there's something that's very fundamental to all of it, but as I've mentioned, there was a time when I loved the process of the deep refinement of design decisions. At this point, I'm very captivated by bigger strategic questions about tackling these very complicated problems, about moving a profession from one place to the next and moving the perception of the entire social sector of our world towards understanding how to utilize design skills. I mean, those things are terribly interesting questions to me now. And then the mechanics of that, like what does a business model look like to do that? So in a sense, that inspires me. Now, the other inspiration is the inspiration of creativity. And here comes the Eeyore part. I recently heard this quote, which I like quite a bit, which is, inspiration is for amateurs. And I think there's value in this, and that means that you're waiting for something. You're waiting to be inspired in order to exercise your creative skills. You cannot wait. You have to find ways of pulling up your deepest, most creative thoughts without waiting for some magic inspiration to come and descend on you. This is if you want to be a professional designer, if you want to earn your living doing this, if you want to do this reliably and routinely, you have to find ways to put yourself in that space, to open your mind up, to begin to see alternative ways to tackle problems. And I'll say it again, inspiration is for amateurs. That's for somebody who has the time to wait to be inspired by the raindrop on the car hood or whatever it might be. And for most of us, we don't have that luxury. And in fact, I particularly like the discipline of finding that space that I have to enter, and I have to do that multiple times a day, where I know I can think as broadly and as creatively as I'm capable of doing.
One thing that I don't know that we always realize, because we're surrounded by other designers when we're in school, is that the fields of design are, by their very nature, they attract people who are really good at showing up and finding that creative spark. And although we don't think of it that way, that's about presence. That's about being completely passionately engaged in something. And that's where the creativity really resides. It's not something you do, it's something you open into.
Do you guys do life drawing as part of your this school? Are you doing charcoal drawing of still lifes or nudes or anything like that? If you find yourself there, it's one of the places where you can discover this or not discover it, where if you are distracted, if you can't focus on a kind of almost unfocusedness, you cannot draw well. If you can do that, even somebody who doesn't have the kind of technical skills can draw well. Interestingly enough, it has to also, this is my own insight, whether it's true or not, it also has to do with shooting a gun. And I've only had a chance to do this a couple of times, but a friend of mine, or this kind of non-focus, right? Yeah. So in shooting a gun, forgive me for saying this. So in shooting a gun, the general practice, and this is, there's a whole Taoist way of thinking about all this stuff. The general practice is that if you make a conscious decision to squeeze the trigger, you will pull and you'll be off target. And so the thing to do is to squeeze very, very lightly, squeeze, 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 not ever thinking, I'm shooting now. As soon as you think, now I'm shooting, you jerk slightly and it's off. So all you're doing is the process of squeezing, and you try to keep as calm as you can. The process of squeezing, and as soon as you realize you're thinking about it or you're trying too hard, you have to stop. now you go back, squeeze, 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 and then it goes off. And that's the most accurate thing. And the Buddhists talk about archery. Is it not Buddhist? I think you would. Well, anyway,
I don't know.
Maybe the Taoist. I think.
I'm
think
sure
about,
we've all used it.
and they talk about you release the bow as the leaf falls from the tree in autumn. so it's just like it never happens, and then you do it. And that's all about this business of concentration, but in a kind of slightly off-center concentration. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the creative process, that kind of strange space that you find. Right. See, now even I'm talking about this crazy spiritual stuff. Ruined me.
And I was taken completely out of the presence because I'm thinking, which one of my students actually had you point the gun at me?
Yeah, that is definitely a thought.
I think the most interesting thing about this this talk here is that you're both talking about this sort of transition you went through in your careers from, graduating from school and then being out there working in whatever economic, aquarium you're swimming in as far as the economy and, having jobs, whatever comes along. And you've managed to make a transition that not everyone makes from being just another designer commodity, out there like any other architect or designer to getting to this place where you actually went proactive, decided I'm about this or I'm going to explore this, and took action on your own in order to sort of escape that. And it occurs to me we've got a whole room full of designers who are about to graduate and go out there and be just another person who can run Photoshop or can, pick paint swatches or whatever. It's like, how can you talk a little bit more about making that transition from being, just another employee, just another whoever, into being somebody that's, made that shift?
Well, I would say that none of us are just another designer. Part of that thought process is that if you're comparing yourself to someone else, and if you're looking at, well, I'm just doing the same as everybody else, or that person's better than me, you're always looking outside yourself. But recognize that every experience you're having is yours and yours alone to experience completely. So no matter what you're doing, last night I said, whether you're I forget what the analogy was I used, but whether you're cleaning bathrooms for a living or you're a great professor, your life experience has the potential of being very powerful. It's actually not about the content of what you're doing. And then once you start to realize that, once you start to just completely engage in whatever you're doing, the opportunities come your way. All you have to do is pay attention. And pay attention both to, as I was describing, that something that happens inside which makes you think, I have got to start writing in my case. It was unequivocal. It's like, okay, I've got something to say, I'm going to find a way to write. Or whether it's somebody that shows up on your doorstep with a new project for you and your life changes completely that day. You can't know when those things are going to happen, and you don't need to be forcing it. You just do what you do with all your heart and soul. And as you do that, the opportunities show up. It's not the way that we think it is. It's in a way, it sounds like I'm actually contradicting John, but I'm not. We're both saying very much the same thing. You make your own magic, but you make your own magic by being completely engaged in what you're doing. And in your case, there was something that really was overpoweringly interesting to you all of a sudden, and you started to go down that road. Those things happen in life. It's when you say, oh, I couldn't do that you're stopping the flow. So you can. If the thought has arisen, I could do this, try it. And if everything in you is saying, oh my gosh, I can't do that, definitely try it.
Yeah, we are talking about the same thing, and yet there is so many interesting differences. And so my immediate response to how do you not be just another, cad monkey or whatever the term is, and your thought was, well, you're not, and my thought was, you are, and that's okay.
That's right, that's right.
So that is part of the process. That doesn't mean you have to put up with it. Doesn't mean that that's the choice you have to make, but that experience can be very valuable. That this idea of being like everybody else and being just another postgraduate is not a bad place to be. It's actually a good place to be, and it's actually a great place to be right now. By the way, the profession is more interesting today than it was 20 years ago when I got out of school. This is actually a good time to do what you're doing. It's turbulent, it's difficult, but it's actually very, very interesting and more valuable than it was when we got out of school. The opportunity to impact people's lives, to do meaningful work is greater today than it was a while ago. So it's okay to be at this moment one of the masses. Begin to think about what it is that you want. And so one of the slight differences, and I'm bringing this up because different people respond to different things, even though I do think we're talking about much the same way. In one sense, there's a message from Sarah, and I'm not going to get this right, but maybe this is my perception, that if I'm well, if I'm balanced, if I'm good, it will come to me. And I'm not someone who thinks of themselves as balanced and has made it there. So that's going to miss me. I'll never get there. I have to wait for that. I'll have to wait to be a good, balanced person before it all to come to me. And because I'm not that person, whether I am or not, I don't know, but that's my perception, is I'm not that person, then I have to do it my way. I've got to find a way where I can choose it. And I would suggest that for many of you, you may not feel like you're that balanced person. You're not that person who can be absolutely present. That doesn't mean that you can't choose, that you can't do what you desire. And I definitely agree, if it scares the hell out of you, that might be something to really pay attention to. And that if you think you can't do it, that's actually possibly the reason to step in that direction. It's not a reason not to step in that direction. I think Sarah's way is that things come, and that's probably because she's so capable as a person with discipline, as a person who can be focused and can be effective. I mean, I'm reading into this, I don't know. And that the serendipitous seems more outside or more magical. I'm comfortable with the serendipitous. I'm comfortable with the chaotic world. The discipline is hard for me. So I desire the discipline part. And so one of the things, and this is going to sound terribly disciplined, but I believe in it deeply, and I've watched in my own practice. There are 4 things you have to do if you want to accomplish something. That doesn't mean that you can't have a good life. It doesn't mean that you can't, have a good, meaningful career for you. But if you want something, there are 4 things you have to do. You have to have an idea or a goal. That's critical. A lot of people are moving forward without something. You have to have an idea or a goal. And by the way, those are hard things to get, and it eluded me for a very long time. You have to have a plan to achieve that goal or idea. You have to execute on that, and then you have to watch and be aware, because you have to adjust all along the way, because all that will change. The idea will change, the plan will change, but you have to do those 4 things. If you want to achieve something that is deeply meaningful to you, that requires proactive, not just, I would say this about your family, I would say this about your relationships. What are you trying to achieve? Do you have an idea? Do you have a plan to achieve that? You have to execute on that, and then you have to watch like crazy to adjust all the time, because it's always going to change.
I'll say, let me just add one thought. And life will move you in that direction, whether you're looking at it through the way that John described it or I'm describing it. It's actually the same thing.
I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about your student experiences, and I'm going to be self-serving. I teach the history of design here, and you started to talk about some historical designers that inspired you, but I'd be curious to hear more about what role history played in your student experiences, in your training, and if there are specific experiences with history that inspired you.
Do you want to go first? No, go ahead. I was in school during an interesting period where there was very little history taught. I think there was a period of architectural education where it was sort of the post-international style modern movement, and there had been this kind of dissociation from history. And so although we had history classes, it wasn't very highly respected. And so what I learned was really from my European roots and from traveling and actually experiencing firsthand the power of those buildings that were made very, very long ago and how much they spoke to me. It's not that I didn't have any history in my education, but it was limited in its influence, and people weren't valuing it. I think that that's probably changed in the time since I was in school. I certainly hope so, because there's so much to learn from the past. But that there's no substitute for going and experiencing yourself. I mean, just the Fountain Street Church that I was speaking in last night has that quality of historical wonder about it, that you know that whoever created it was very deeply involved in making something of great beauty and something that would inspire. And a lot of the way that design has happened in the past has been with that as a motivating force, a goal. We have been through periods of our history where we've lost that, or where we've changed the attitude about what it is that we're doing. But you can go and experience all those different types of structures and feel what it does to you. And as you feel that, you start to get your own compass on how it can inform you. So I think that the going and kicking the tires part of education is incredibly important.
I went to an art school. I chose it very specifically. I started in landscape architecture, and I was very interested in the sort of overlap of art and landscape architecture, as opposed to landscape and horticulture, which was really the core of most of the landscape programs in the country at the time that I was looking. And so I was very much interested in an art way of approaching this, and I imagine this is embedded in this school to some degree. And as far as the designers that I found interesting in the history of design, at the time I was very much interested in these sort of very subtle designers, Sigurd Leverance and I certainly Lou Kahn, I thought was, and still do think is a really extraordinary designer. Very much, even though I talked a lot about the details of things, and I encourage people to do this as much as you can, very much think about the creation of space and the value of that, and the what you can actually feel from space. One of the things that I think I provided that was most valuable in the work that I did, the residential work that I did, is create residential environments that people felt comfortable in, and I believe that color has something to do with that. I believe that tactility has something to do with that, but I also believe the volume is so important. One of the tests that I would do is after we finished a house is that I would try to find an opportunity to play loud music in the house, And music, noise, sound has a way, you use it, I think, we're more like bats than maybe we'd like to think, but you use it as a way of understanding the parameters of your space. And that very careful understanding of how far that ceiling is away from me, how far that wall is away from me, has a real impact, I believe, on our own sense of well-being and our own sense of comfort. And I was very interested in designers who were very skillful at that. Though we don't, rarely do we talk about that as designers. It's, I think, terribly powerful. Are some of you guys focused on healthcare design or different aspects? And we don't have to raise your hands, but if some of you are focused on those kinds of things, commercial design, residential design, whatever it might be, some of these things just so important. Inches matter with the quality of a hospital room or an exam room. These inches really, really matter. It's so much fun to get to a point where you really have an understanding of that. That needs to be 2 more inches further away.
Yeah.
And to be able to see that in drawings, and I know this challenge of reading drawings, and even for the profession, very difficult. But, you know, I really delighted in the ability to look at a quarter scale drawing and be able to make those, that's too close. I imagine it's like a musician looking at music, written music, and can hear the music in their mind as they look at it on the page. And I know some musicians who do this, and they talk about the joy that they have seeing that, like, oh, I hear that music, I see that music, and that's wrong, or that's right, or that's beautiful. And to be able to look at drawings, to be able to look at these things we use ways to make decisions, and to be able to understand that's not right, or that is right, oh, that's just right. That's a really delightful thing. It's a wonderful place to get to as a designer, and whether that's drawings or models or whatever it might be. And then, of course, you can test it. You got to walk and look, and you go, oof, you know. Didn't get that one quite right, got that one right. Mostly, that was one of the few things that, you know, my non-Eeyore nature, somehow I was able to do that, and rarely was I disappointed that I had managed that incorrectly. What a terrible way to ruin that question and go to there.
No, not at all.
I see that we are probably at the limit on these chairs here. Everyone's starting to squirm. So I'm just going to recap this. This whole thing started with me meeting Ryan for coffee, saying I'd like to get some tickets for the ASID kids for Thursday night's talk. And I don't even know what happened, but it was magic. And thank you so much, because this is more than I could ever ask for.
Absolutely.
Let me see if there's anything else that we need to cover before I send a thank you to you. We have a little Kendall piece here, and Lauren's going to present this from the Kendall student body.
I'm an ASID representative, and I wanted to thank you very much for taking time to come today. So we have a couple of
Thank you.
bags for you here.
Terrific.
And we really appreciate you taking your time to do this for us.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.
And the other thing I didn't quite get right is the breakfast, which is now here. So please stay after. Talk amongst yourselves. Hopefully you'll be here for a little bit.
And
We can
am I
talk to you.
doing a book signing? Somebody said I was.
If we have
Yes.
books here, I know there are some people that brought books. We would love to have you sign them.
I think the bookstore was, did they decide not to?
Yeah, we're going to do, we have a lot of books that Sarah has written, at least 6 of the titles, and they're back in the church. So if you don't have a book with you, and one of those books is something that you're interested in purchasing, we're just a block up the street, and I think a lot of us are going to head back that way. So, Sarah, we won't
Yep.
take up a lot of your time. I know she has a plane to catch.
That's fine.
But I'd love to have that opportunity again.
Absolutely.
There
And
are a lot of books for Sarah.
And if you're shy about asking a question out loud amongst everybody, you can sure come up afterwards and ask or have me sign something, anything.
Thank you very much. Your time is so appreciated, but not nearly so much as your knowledge and sharing with us today. It's very valuable. So thank you.
Thank you.